when you're ready.
Hello and greetings, Vítame, from your National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm Cecilia Rokusek, the President and CEO. And for me, it is a distinct honor to be able to visit with you today about a concern that we are all sharing across this global society. And I want to commend the Czechoslovak Genealogy Society and certainly Mark Dillon for putting together this esteemed group to talk about this very, very important subject. Let me tell you, first of all, why I became so interested in the Ukrainian situation and why I've been speaking literally across the country about it. And it simply is two reasons. Number one, the Ukrainians, like we Czechs and Slovaks, are Slavic people. So is Russia, so is Belarus, and so is former Yugoslavia, made up of Slavic people. But we in the Czech and Slovak republics are especially cognizant and recognize the important role that Slavic people have played in the world and the important contributions that Slavic people. So in essence, the Ukrainians are our brothers and sisters. Like us, they are Slavic people, and it's important for us to work with them and help support them in their fight for democracy, freedom, and human rights. The second reason is that I still serve as an honorary Slovak consul. And my very, very, very good friend is the Slovak Honorary Consul in Odessa. Michael and his wife Anna and his assistant Daria have been to visit me many times. And most recently, they came to Cedar Rapids, Iowa in January of this very year. And we're here at the National Czech and Slovak Museum. They are members of our museum and have a real interest in particular, the Slavic countries, and most especially, obviously, Ukraine and Slovakia, since Michael serves as a Slovak Honorary Consul. We've been friends for over 12 years. So when the war broke out in February, we were all very, very concerned because we have been such close friends, and the concern was very personal, and especially now as the Soviet, or I should say the Russian, not the Soviet, but as the Russian forces try to capture the Black Sea and move in on the port town of Odessa, I'm very concerned. Recently, I was speaking to 600 high school students in Moline, Illinois, and we were visiting with Daria, and there were bombs going out and off, and we could hear them just 5 blocks from her. So we're very concerned about this, both on a global perspective, and for me, it's a very personal perspective. I speak with my colleagues twice a day, in the morning for me, which is mid-afternoon for them, and at night, and as they get up in the morning. So it's always a good day and a good night kind of scenario, and I'm sharing with them each day our concern and our love. And I just want to talk with you a little bit today about why we, as the National Czech and Slovak Museum, are concerned, and why I personally am very concerned about this, and share some stories and then open it up for discussion. Later on in the program, you'll actually hear from my good friend Daria live from Ukraine. So let's get started. With my first slide there, you'll see that I have the Ukrainian flag on the left-hand side. And probably, if you don't know, it's a very simple flag, blue and yellow. And blue really represents peace. And in their flag, they have always been stewards of peace, looking for peace and democracy. And so the blue is a very good color to represent their ongoing stand for peace, and peace not only for their country but for the world. And the yellow is for prosperity, and in particular for also the wheat fields. As you probably know, Ukraine is a breadbasket for much of Europe, and is certainly an important one for Central Europe. And the wheat fields and the fertile farm ground of Ukraine is being challenged right now with all of the bombings going on and the destruction of property. So we hope and pray that there will not be a food shortage. But we do know that Ukraine is an important food producer for the world, and particularly Europe. And then you'll see on the map there, and you might, as Czechs and Slovaks, be especially concerned and knowledgeable about the fact that about 47 miles of the Slovak border borders Ukraine. The Czech Republic does not obviously border it, but they have received nearly 300,000 immigrants, as has Slovakia received over 300,000 immigrants. And certainly the other countries, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and certainly Poland, getting the majority of our immigrants from Ukraine. This is a situation that 3-4 months ago, no one would have thought the magnitude of this really refugee, we'll say, challenge that these countries are facing. The Czechs and Slovaks, as the Poles, have been more than welcoming as the other countries, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, to these refugees and given their homes to them to share in both food and housing. And so we have to be very, very proud of our brothers and sisters who have done that. I've spoken to several of my relatives in the Czech and Slovak republics, and all of them have either taken in refugees or are supporting them in so many ways through their donations. One of my artist friends has had a very active art auction, so that clearly the key now will be to make sure the war doesn't go on for too long, and that's a questionable area, because the destruction, the major challenge will be rebuilding the country of Ukraine after this war is over. And the question that we do not know right now is how long this war will go on. And then you'll see on the right-hand screen another picture that is very dear to me, because I do have a Ukrainian Kroi, as we might call it, but a Ukrainian ethnic folkwear. And their folkwear is sort of resembles our Czech and Slovak folkwear. They do a lot of in the reds and blacks, especially their embroidery handiwork is a lot in the reds and the blacks. They do have very elegant dresses, but a lot of the embroidery, again, is colorful, primarily red. Red is the color they often use. And their head pieces they love to have. The Ukrainian headpieces are among the beautiful, much like the Slovak headpieces, very ornate, very flowerful, and sometimes they can be very, very large. The Ukrainian ones, much like some of the larger headpieces that you'll see in eastern Slovakia. So we do again have that Slavic, I call them brothers and sisters, because we do have some resemblances, and especially if you look in Slovakia in the Carpatho-Russian area, which is very close to Ukraine, you'll see these similarities throughout the folkwear in those regions. Next slide, please. So our world is changing. We never thought it would happen in the 21st century. And this is a picture from Kiev. And I say this because as a young woman growing up in Tabor, South Dakota, my father, who was a veteran of World War II, used to say to me, Cecilia, you'll never have to worry about a war in your lifetime, or at least a world war in your lifetime. And I guess, there were always conflicts throughout the world in the last 50 years, but I never thought about a war of a magnitude of a world war. And is the Ukrainian war a world war? Not yet, but certainly we know all of the challenges with NATO and all of the challenges that if any NATO country were attacked, it would become probably a world war. And then there's the other possibility that goes along with that. Would we have nuclear destruction that would go along with another world war? And these are all questions that none of us know the answer to. Certainly there's a lot of study going on, what ifs and so forth. But for me, the key, as I talk to my colleagues on a daily basis, is how long will this war last, and when will the destruction stop? Because there is significant destruction. And then we have the very, very horrific atrocities of the death of many, many innocent people. And when will that stop? So these are the questions to me that are really paramount in terms of, we do have a regional war, but it brings on becoming a world war, certainly. And that then could affect some of our homeland, and certainly much of Europe as well. So these are things, and when I was speaking to this high school group the other day, one of the students said, what is the take-home message that you want for us? And I said, the take-home message is twofold. I want you to, number one, continually to read the paper, listen to the news, be very much aware of what is going on in our world, so that as you become an adult, you will know how important it is to maintain democracy, to strive for peace, and to really have the freedoms that we all have in a democratic society, and the individual human rights that are so important to all of us. And I said the second thing that you can do is, as you become an adulthood, really strive to make sure this never happens again. And when I said that, one young lady rose her hand and she said, but we have so many examples in history of which this has been an ongoing challenge, an ongoing struggle. Certainly the most the most one in recent history that we can all remember, I should say, is the Holocaust. And people said the Holocaust you know, was one of the worst atrocities in human history. It was. And we vowed that it would never happen again. And and then we look at Lidice in the Czech Republic, in which a whole community was totally wiped out by the Nazis, and all the men killed, and out of 100 plus children, only 9 remained. So how did we let this happen then? And we asked ourselves after Lidice, for example, after the Holocaust, we cannot let this happen again. How could it happen? What we are seeing now, and other kinds of wars that we've seen in the Congo, that we've seen in Syria, has been similar, but this impact of this one in Europe in a free democratic society is happening right before our very eyes. So when you look at this question, how could it happen in the 21st century? And as the student said, how can we let it happen again when we vowed that it would not happen, is a question that we must all take to heart. My father, a simple barber, used to say to me, Cecilia, we would have no world wars if people only knew each other and respected each other. And as I grew into my adulthood and thought about those, I have to really say he was right on. And we as Czechs and Slovaks and Poles and other Slavic people, I think have such a strong history of openness, of kindness, but most of all, I think of always nonviolent aggression and making sure that we fight for our freedom and democracy. That's what our forefathers did. That's what our ancestors did. And it was not always easy, but they did it. And I think that that's why right now what's going on in Ukraine is so heartbreaking, because these people, you know, since the 90s have had freedom. They've built a democratic society. And as my friend Michael in Odessa would say, we were living a good life, and then this happens. So we cannot let this happen again. So here is a map, and on this map you can again see, I always say that Europe is like America, except the countries are, there are countries, and here in America, they're states. So if we think about many of the countries of Europe and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, they are really like states in the United States, very small in some. But Ukraine is quite large. And so we bring to mind a lot of discussion, what if the Russians and Putin do capture and take over Ukraine, what will happen? I know that he's talked about doing away with the Ukrainian language, doing away with anything Ukrainian to all become Russian. I don't think personally that that will happen. There may be some compromise and the country could get split, which is always frightening, because in 2014, again, Putin and the Russians took Crimea, and I thought they were going to stop there and maybe some of the eastern Donetsk region and so forth, but they have continued now to go on. When will it stop? How much will they take? And will there be a compromise? And will there be a treaty? And those are the questions that I think really need a lot of discussion and a lot of really forward thinking, because how long will this war last, and what will the impact then be to our global society in terms of not only challenges to freedom and democracy, but also challenges to the economy and to the ongoing inflation. So these are all interrelated. And the thing that also frightens me a bit when I talk about our homelands is the fact that Russia is a major provider of gas and oil to much of Central Europe, and in fact Europe overall. If in fact we've seen them cutting off gas to Poland, if in fact Russia were to cut off our heating supplies and our heating, our gas and our oil, that could have significant impact to our homelands in the future, especially as we head for the fall and winter. So we need to be vigilant and hope and pray that this war ends soon, because then the next phase will be the rebuilding phase, and that will not be an easy task. So why do we need at this point to talk about cultural identity? And that's really what I am most interested in as the president of our National Museum and CEO, about preserving our rich cultural identity. And no matter if you're Czech, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian, it is so important that we preserve our cultural identity. And in this particular war, Putin and his soldiers are trying to strip the cultural identity of Ukrainians. And that, to me, certainly the loss of lives is significant and the destruction of property. But when you try to take a country, Ukraine is well over 1,500 years old. They're a very rich culture, full of tradition, full of beauty, and land full of rich farmland, plus a lot of natural minerals. And to say that that country does not exist then, or you cannot speak the Ukrainian language, as Putin has said, is really something very fearful to me in terms of loss of cultural identity as a Slavic nation. And that's where it becomes so critically important that we work to stop this war in any way that we can and pray that it stops, because the threats on cultural identity, certainly freedom, democracy, and our individual rights are most important, but that cultural identity piece is equally important. As I've said before in speaking to CGSI about preserving our Czech and Slovak cultural identity, this is very important for the Ukrainians as well, because they do have this rich 1,000-plus-year-old history, and they seem to want it to go away from the Russian and Putin side. And Belarus has also joined in that, as you know. So that cultural identity, I like to tell people now that I'm an American with Czech and Slovak ancestry. And I think that is so important as we in the United States, as a melting pot, that we begin to say that. When I teach students, I always say, what is your cultural ancestry? And that in this case, when we're talking about Ukraine, is so important, because to think that any one person or any one country would come in, invade another country to strip them of their cultural identity. Again, we may all be Americans, but we all have some sort of, whether it be Native American, whether it be Irish, whether it be Polish, we all have a cultural identity. And so this, to me, is like the third leg on this disastrous situation. We have the lives lost, we have the destruction of property, but we're also having this challenge to lose our cultural identity, and then all of those are supporting the main reason that the Ukrainians are fighting is not only for their cultural identity, but to preserve freedom and democracy. So those are all kind of wrapped into the stool, and if any one of those, which are already the destruction, we cannot lose our identity, and then above all, that the support of that stool, which is democracy and freedom for the people, for the country, must be maintained. So I really want to stress that. You don't often hear about that in some of the negotiations that were going on. One of Putin's points were that if the country were to be taken over, a part of the country at least, were to be taken over by Russia, that they could not speak the Ukrainian language there anymore. And we all know from studies that have gone on that once a country or a culture loses its loss of language, that culture eventually goes away. So I think it's so important that we remember that as we look on the struggles that the Ukrainians are having, in addition to everything else going on in their lives. So, lessons from the Czechs and Slovaks. This was an interesting question that I was asked by the local media, and I had to step back, and my response was, it's a duplicate. It's like a reproduction of what happened to the Czechs and Slovaks in '68, when the Soviets at that time invaded in '68. Fortunately, there was not a large death toll. The young man in Prague, but that burned himself. But there was not. They did invade, though. They instilled fright in the people in '68, and they came into Slovakia. It was Czechoslovakia then, but in the Czech Republic, and so that is very reminiscent. And then all we have to do is look in Hungary in 1956, when the Soviets did it again, and at that time it was more reminiscent of what's going on now in Ukraine with all the lives lost. So that we do have these parallels in among our homelands that I thought would never happen again. I know we always prepare for war, we're always positioned for war, but that's a security for a country. But to think that someone would actually invade a country for their own personal greed and their own personal wealth and to wipe out a cultural identity is probably the most serious situation that we've had since the Holocaust. So I think there are a lot of reminiscent factors to the Czech and Slovak stories and to others in Central and Eastern Europe. But in the 21st century, as someone said, how can we let this happen? So, so what can we do? I think that there are a lot of responses to that. Certainly, support is been incredible from around the world, and that will be ongoing. I think they will need a lot of support post-war to rebuild, because if you look at the massive destruction, I was lucky enough to have been in much of Ukraine in 2016, 15 and 16, when we went to visit our friends there, and toured several places throughout that time period, including Chernobyl, which, as you know, that was a very hot spot, literally, in this conflict, and Kyiv and Lviv, and certainly Odessa, Kharkiv. And there is no doubt that it is a beautiful country, and the destruction that's happened to date will need a lot of resources for rebuilding. So I think that the help now seems to be, from a world perspective, quite good, ongoing. In most regions, food is accessible. They are having some problems with water in the eastern section, but there are convoys coming through. So what can we do now? I think continue to support them as much as we can through the goodwill efforts of so many organizations. But then I think also keeping in mind that there will be needs following this war for rebuilding. I think also what we can do is, if you have any contacts there, or if you know of people there, please keep in touch with them. That kind of encouragement from the United States is so important. I know when we talk twice a day, it's always words of encouragement. Be resilient, be careful, and they in turn are grateful to the United States for all of their support from all levels. We've had not only from the government, certainly, but from individuals, from organizations. And I think that's the most important that we can do. If we know of relatives in the Czechoslovak Republic or Poland, that we can also encourage them and help them if they have refugees in their home, because that is an added cost burden for them as well. I know that that's an important area to help as well if you have relatives that are taking refugees in. So there's a lot we can do. There will be a whole lot more in the rebuilding, and there will be a whole lot more if this doesn't end soon. So I think the big question that probably is in all of your minds is, if it doesn't stop soon, will Putin and the Russians continue to move west? And that's the million-dollar question, or billion-dollar question, certainly. And will the cutting off of energy supplies, i.e. gas and oil, affect our homelands? That's the other big question that we have to be very concerned about. So I think those are two big areas that we are big question marks, and the only quick answer would be a quick end to the war and less destruction, and I think then we could probably begin a rebuilding plan that will not be easy, as I said, and will be very costly. I do know that the good thing that's happening from my colleague, the Slovak Honorary Council, is that they are working with students to make sure they can go to school, for example, in Slovakia, college and university students, and they're helping refugees as much as they can. But you have to remember that there have been a lot of, almost 6 million refugees now, and growing. But the country does have a large population that are staying. So they are, even some have come back now and gone back into Kyiv. So that's both good and bad, but we don't know when this war will end. The bottom line is that the struggles for freedom and democracy are heroic on the Ukrainian part, and we are all to be commended for the support that we've given them. And as my colleague in Odessa said this morning, we love you all in America, and keep us in our prayers, and most of all, know that we will rebuild, and we will be stronger and bigger and better, and democracy will prevail. So I think those are really strong words, because they are really reminiscent of what we did in the Czech and Slovak republics during the era of the Soviets and communism. So freedom and democracy are precious, and we can never forget that. And I think we have a lot to learn from our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And I hope that this little overview of how it's really closer than we think. When we think about it's just a 13-hour flight overseas. And if you're in the Czech and Slovak republics, or in Poland, or any of the bordering countries, it's just an hour. And thankfully now the refugees are not leaving as they were. My friend said that 3 weeks ago they took a family to Romania, and they were going 25 kilometers, and it took them 3 days. So that gives you the breadth and the magnitude of how people really did want to leave. They were frightened, and they still are leaving, but now it's not as easy because they're unsure of some of the roads to take. So it really is a very cautious time, and one that we can't forget the power of prayer. And if not, then certainly please remember them in your thoughts and spiritual thoughts, whatever they may be. And with that, I sign off from the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, and I'm just going to make sure that we have concluded with the slideshow, which we have, and then at the end of this program today, we're going to hook you up to Odessa. So thank you very much, and please come and see us at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.